Until around the start of my senior year of high school, which was the fall of 2015, I was a dickhead. I got in trouble a bunch and was sort of directionless. That fall, the dad of one of my classmates showed everyone at my school a documentary he had made in the Balkans where he was volunteering with the Syrian refugee crisis. He was Syrian, and I think it was something about like seeing the people making the documentary also distributing aid that inspired me. And so, I asked the dad, like, what can I do to help? Thinking he's going to say bake sale. Instead, he asked me, what are you doing in a month? And if I wanted to go with him to Greece and Turkey to volunteer. And I went with him on a trip that would fundamentally shift my worldview and get me interested in all this stupid politics stuff I talk about on this channel. And I got back from that trip around 10 years ago, which feels like a notable marker in my life. So I figure for just a bit, I'd sort of go over the last 10 years and try to really break down why it is I feel the way I do about politics and philosophy and stuff, and maybe get some of my millions of viewers to see things from my perspective. Before I left for Greece that first time, everyone was calling what was happening the Syrian refugee crisis. And it was a Syrian refugee crisis. By 2015, Syria had descended into chaos after the Bashar al-Assad government responded brutally to Arab Spring protests in 2011. Shut up, Tankies. Following, rebel groups, many of them radical, began fighting for control of the country with U.S. support as Assad's government, later backed by Russia, launched a crushing air campaign whose toll was primarily civilian. And then, in 2014, ISIS is formed in eastern Syria and western Iraq. Their pre-formation funding coming covertly through the U.S. I have receipts. And their post-formation funding coming from U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. In response to their rise, Obama spearheads with several other countries an air campaign that killed 2,300 civilians in its first 2 years. And due to all of this and more that's just a cursory overview, around 7 million Syrians fled the country, most of them into neighboring countries like Egypt, Turkey, and Lebanon, though a minority of them, between 1 to 2 million, left for Europe. Now, of course, even though Western European countries were also in various capacities embroiled in the Syrian civil war, refugees wouldn't just simply be allowed into the European Union. If they tried to enter the EU from, say, Turkey at a port of entry, they would be turned away. However, if they showed up on a boat in Italy or Greece, where I was, then they would have to be processed. And the thing is, the boat ride from Turkey to Greece could be and has often been deadly. In the past 10 years, over 1,600 people have died attempting to make the journey on crappy rubber dinghies, while every day ferries travel back and forth between Greece and Turkey. On that first trip, I went back and forth between Greece and Turkey on one of those ferries. And so for the first 2 weeks I spent on Chios, working with the locally run Chios Eastern Shore Response Team, or CERS, which is now off an arm, it was a miracle no one died. On one of the nights alone, we received 36 boats, and I remember thinking it was just like endless. We'd be at one landing trying to get people with hypothermia warm, and on the way to go replenish supplies, we would run into another landing and have to try to help people with no supplies. That night, one of the lifeguards handed me a tiny Syrian baby and said, change her, she's wet. And I'm 18 thinking like, okay, I gotta change this diaper. And then I realized when he puts her in my arms, the lifeguard meant she's wet, as in she had fallen into the sea in the winter and needed dry clothes or she might die. And to reiterate, if the EU had just allowed refugees to travel through the ports of entry, this baby still would have shown up into Greece, but not wet. But coming back to that Syrian refugee crisis thing. It was a Syrian refugee crisis, but it was also a Western colonial and foreign policy crisis. Because on on that first trip, I met just as many people from Iraq, Afghanistan, as I did from Syria. And in fact, the first boat I witnessed make it to Chios was full of people from Afghanistan. And that's what really got me into reading about US foreign policy, because I knew enough that the US had went to war with Afghanistan and Iraq. And so in my reading, I later learned that the US had been f***ing with the Middle East as far back as 1938, when the California Arab Standard Oil Company, which is now Aramco, drilled into what would later be realized to be the largest source of petroleum in the world in Dammam, Saudi Arabia. And 7 years later, the State Department called the Middle East and North Africa a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. Dwight Eisenhower would describe the region as probably the richest economic prize in the field of foreign investment. Now, skipping over a lot, the US would organize Middle East policy around protecting US foreign investment, particularly from nationalist governments who are often written off as communists. One 1951 State Department policy statement on Saudi Arabia found that it was in the US's interests that a strong government control Saudi Arabia, despite how autocratic and repressive it might be, seeing as Saudi Arabia had the strategic advantages of geographical position, petroleum resources, and the continued general antipathy of the Saudi Arabs for communism. In 1953, the CIA sent Teddy Roosevelt's grandson, Kermit Roosevelt, with millions of dollars to overthrow Iran's democratically elected leader Mohammad Mossadegh, who had nationalized Iran's oil industry. Following, the US propped up the deeply repressive Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who put torture chambers under shopping malls and extracted people's teeth. In 1958, an NSC memorandum was written that noted Arab nationalism could be defeated by supporting Israel as the only strong pro-West power left in the Near East. And since 1967, the US has supported Israel to the tune of billions every year as they bombed basically every country in the world. Now, following the fall of the Berlin Wall, then Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney and his Undersecretary Paul Wolfowitz began formulating a geopolitical program for a unipolar world, culminating in a 1992 document titled Defense Planning Guidance. That document identifies that a primary goal of US foreign policy should be to preclude any hostile power from dominating a region critical to our interests, and also thereby to strengthen the barriers against the reemergence of a global threat to the interests of the US or our allies. And it would identify the Middle East as a region where the US's overall objective should be to remain the predominant outside power in the region and preserve US and Western access to the region's oil. Jeremy Scahill writes, following 9/11, the world is a battlefield was the mantra repeated by the neoconservatives in the US national security apparatus and placed on PowerPoint slides laying out the plans for a sweeping, borderless global war. And that December, Dick Cheney claimed that there were 40 or 50 countries that potentially needed military disciplining. Almost immediately, the US went to war with Afghanistan, which became the longest war in US history. We would topple Saddam, leading to the deaths of 1 million Iraqis. The Obama drone program would target 7 different countries, several of them undeclared battlefields, and NATO, led by the US, would overthrow Gaddafi in an extremely brutal fashion and ultimately plunge Libya into chaos. And I met the people who fled all that violence. Over the course of my trips to Greece, I met people from Yemen, Palestine, Libya, Sudan, Somalia, all across Africa. And as an American, you can't help but feel responsible. In 2017, we received a boat one night, and this man from Iraq asked me where I was from, and I say the States, because for some reason we all say the States when we're not in the US, but in the US we say the US, and he goes, American, you destroyed my country. And like, holy what do you say to that? We literally did for oil and privatization schemes. And I remember running through my head were the images of Abu Ghraib and the footage that Michael Moore includes in Fahrenheit 9/11. And I'm trying to say something that might remedy the decades of US foreign policy. And he goes, relax, Ed. I know you didn't destroy Iraq. But further, I saw how the powers of the world reacted to the chaos of empire. The EU-Turkey deal, signed in March of 2016, determined Turkey would deploy the Coast Guard to the waters off the Turkish coast and crack down on human smuggling, while refugees in the Greek islands would be resettled between Turkey and the EU, and Turkey would receive EU funding. Now, hovering over this was Turkey's hope for accession into the EU. Following the failed 2016 coup against President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the human rights situation in Turkey sharply deteriorated, dissuading EU member states from supporting Turkish membership. And on July 6, 2017, a resolution was adopted in European Parliament calling for the suspension of talks on accession between the EU and Turkey. At the time, many voiced worries that Erdogan might use the refugee crisis as a political tool. And on July 28th, while I was volunteering with CERS, now off an arm, we received 2 boats of refugees from Syria who told us smugglers had hastily sent them off with little notice as the Coast Guard, peculiarly absent, had left what they saw as a window. Now for us, and this is pure opinion, Erdogan, don't sue me, it seemed like this was Erdogan applying pressure. That same night, we got word from activists in Turkey that another rushed attempt had capsized off of Turkey's coast, killing 7 people. 2 women and 5 children. And I watched as a fellow volunteer held a baby that had been on one of the boats that made it and said to himself, this baby could have been on that boat. But Erdogan and the EU didn't give a fuck about that baby or the babies who didn't make it. In the same way that Trump doesn't give a fuck that his Air Force killed over 100 girls between the ages of 7 and 12 in Iran. The powerful just sort of play games with everyone else, you know? And those people they play games with that you might read about in the news or see on TV, they're very real people. And that's why I'm an anarchist, but more on that later. How about this? Go donate to CERS, which is now off an arm. Donate to Fairfax Mutual Aid, the mutual aid org Duncan and I work with, and or donate to any one of the links down there providing aid to those who are experiencing the worst of the legacy of colonialism. And of course, like, comment, and subscribe so that publishers will look twice at my new book. And I have a PDF of my old book that I couldn't get published, but if anyone is interested, I'd love to send out a copy.